All right, so yeah, the storming of the Capitol. That was some crazy shit, and it was the result of the culmination of several problems in the United States, and they all came together on January 6th, and you know what happened. These people that stormed the Capitol think they're fighting in defense of democracy by repeating this nonsensical stop the steal narrative that Hugo Chavez, who's been dead since 2013, and the Venezuelan government is orchestrating an operation with the Dominion voting machines in the United States to flip votes from Biden to Trump somehow, or that votes for Trump in several states were just blatantly tossed out, but there's no credible reporting to prove that. There's been hundreds of court cases that have been just laughed out of court. You have crazy right-wing outlets like the Epoch Times, which are affiliated with an insane anti-communist cult that thinks Trump was sent here by the gods to destroy the Chinese Communist Party. Anybody who has a shred of critical thinking skills should know that these allegations coming from the Stop the Steal narrative that this election was stolen is they're nonsensical. Now, you can make the case that there has never been a free and fair election in the United States, and I would agree with that. But that's not because of any of the reasons that they're talking about in the Stop the Steal narrative. That's because of voter suppression, you know, or rigging primaries. The Democratic Party rigs its primaries, but that's very different from rigging a general election. The primary process is basically under control of the DNC and the fucking RNC, and our two political parties are essentially private corporations. And in those primary elections, it's basically an election run by two corporations. And the heads of those corporations can choose who they want to nominate as president. Like, the vote is just a suggestion in the primary. But in the general election, it's not controlled by just that one singular corporation. So you can't use the Democrats rigged their primaries, so the Democrats rigged the general. It doesn't line up. There could be forces within the government that would rather have Joe Biden be the president because they view it as safer to the continuation of the status quo with less public outrage. And that argument definitely makes sense to me. But there's still no credible sources that I can point to that say that there was anywhere nearly enough voter fraud to flip the election. Whether you like it or not, Joe Biden won the popular vote by 70 million votes. So a lot of these reports coming out from these right-wing outlets are saying, oh, a few thousand ballots. The Epoch Times article said 40,000 ballots were thrown out in Pennsylvania. All right, you take a few thousand ballots from a few states, you're not going to overcome that 70 million margin. All right, you're not gonna have enough votes in these states, even if you found every case of fraud. There still wouldn't be enough to overturn the election. Now, I'm not trying to say any of this in defense of Joe Biden. I fucking hate Joe Biden. I hate the Democratic Party. I think the bipartisan establishment in the United States has proven itself to be illegitimate, especially since the start of this pandemic. So, when I see all these people incredibly angry at our institutions, I'm just outraged that their anger has been channeled towards fighting for what is the pure embodiment of everything that is the worst about our society. They've been channeled into supporting Donald Trump. Their anger at the establishment has been directed away from fighting the establishment because these people have been fooled by someone who in reality is a fascist, but who pretends to be a populist, into believing that the cause of their problems are minorities in their own country and people who are worse off than them and more oppressed than them in their own country, rather than the ruling class within the United States, who is pitting the American public against each other into thinking that the other group is the cause of all their suffering, when in reality the cause is really the structure of our society. And that is perpetuated every day by the people in power who refuse to change it. So when people are angry and distrustful of those in power and our established institutions, I can't say they're wrong to be angry and distrustful, but I can say they're wrong when it comes to what they're fighting for, because it's not inherently wrong to storm the Capitol. It's not. It's not inherently wrong to use militant protest. That's what most revolutions are. And revolutions aren't inherently wrong. It just depends why you're doing that revolution and what you're fighting for. If you're storming the Capitol, if you're doing a revolution to destroy the oppressive structure of the American empire, to end poverty, to demand that everyone has health care, to demand an end to the wars, to demand an end to homelessness, those are great reasons. But if you're storming the Capitol and doing a revolution because your fascist daddy, Donald Trump, lost an election and you want to implement him as a dictator, you're wrong. And you know what? You're a fucking fool. You're a fool for allowing your legitimate distrust of those in power to be channeled to fight in the name of fascism. Blatant fascism. You're not a fool for being distrustful of those in power. It's perfectly legitimate to be distrustful of those in power and our established institutions after they have lied to the public for so long, for so many years, about such major issues. From the Gulf of Tonkin to the allegations of WMDs in Iraq, to the more recent allegations of Russian collusion in the 2016 election. These were all lies pushed upon the public by our established institutions. In the case of the Gulf of Tonkin and WMDs in Iraq, those lies were meant to manufacture consent for wars. But in the case of Russiagate, those lies were pushed to increase censorship online and push a narrative that Russia was the cause of our problems in the United States instead of our own ruling class. Lying to the public for so long about such major issues like these only breeds distrust of established institutions. It causes people to go off on their own into dark corners of the internet to look for their own versions of the truth. And a lot of these people, unfortunately, lack critical thinking or any media literacy skills, and they get funneled into crazy, oftentimes racist conspiracy theories online, like most of what's behind this Stop the Steal nonsense. You could see a ton of people at the events that took place on January 6th in D.C., storming the Capitol, that had QAnon flags. We're talking about defeating communists who are trying to take control of the government. Really nonsensical things. But that's an example as to how the American public has no fucking idea what to believe anymore. And a certain amount of people that are rightfully distrustful of our institutions are going to get channeled into supporting horrible people like Donald Trump. And the reality is that so many people wouldn't be fooled into supporting the faux populist, real-time fascist that is Donald Trump if the Democratic Party wasn't so reluctant to advocate for policies that would actually help the public. Some news that was overshadowed by the events of January 6th was that Democrats, Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff, won their Senate races in Georgia, cementing a Democratic majority in both chambers of Congress as Joe Biden is set to take the presidency on January 20th. Now, without Republicans in control of the Senate acting as a roadblock to passing progressive legislation, Democrats will have to take the blame for standing in the way of passing legislation that's supported by a vast majority of the public, such as Medicare for all, a wealth tax, and a $2,000 per month universal basic income. If those policies don't become law over the next 2 years, the only reason is because neoliberal leadership within the Democratic Party is just as opposed to those policies as leadership within the Republican Party, like Mitch McConnell. The last time Democrats controlled both chambers of Congress and the presidency, they passed a Republican health care plan. They allowed 10 million people to be evicted from their homes. They bailed out the big banks, and they refused to prosecute any Wall Street executives for causing the financial crisis. They also expanded the drone program into at least 7 countries with a 90% civilian casualty rate, and they started the most aggressive war on whistleblowers in American history. As Democrats find themselves once again, in complete control of the government, rather than advocating for universal health care in the midst of a pandemic that has caused more than 14 million people to lose their private health insurance. They're expected to advocate for increasing funding for law enforcement, more domestic surveillance, and increased efforts to censor social media, using what happened on January 6th in D.C. as an excuse. The Wall Street Journal has already stated, Mr. Biden said he plans to make a priority of passing a new law against domestic terrorism, and he has been urged to create a White House post overseeing the fight against ideologically inspired violent extremists and increasing funding to combat them. Now, I thought the best analysis of what to expect from Democrats who are taking power in response to what happened on January 6th in D.C. came from Evan Greer, a journalist who has had their work featured in The Washington Post, The Guardian, BuzzFeed, Time, and Wired. In a thread on Twitter, Greer explained that in a response to what happened on January 6th in D.C., Democrats are expected to push for more surveillance, policing, and internet censorship, but that, quote, is the exact opposite of what we need to do. We need to address the problems at its root, systemic racism and injustice. Greer explains what she means further, and I can't think of a better way to wrap this up than quoting her Twitter thread here. The mainstream pundit narrative will focus almost exclusively on the tactics used by those who stormed the Capitol. The tactics are not the point. There is nothing inherently wrong with militant protest. The problem is weaponized white supremacy sparking violence. You'll hear self-avowed progressives call for things like more funding to the FBI to monitor domestic extremist groups. In their imagination, this will be used to target the Proud Boys, while in reality, it will just deepen the surveillance state that harms black and brown communities. You can't stop fascism with authoritarianism. The weaponized white supremacy, patriarchy, and economic injustice that led to this eruption of violence cannot be stopped by cracking down on dissent, criminalizing freedom of expression, or militarizing the police even further. We have work to do. Censorship always silences marginalized voices first. Surveillance always criminalizes black and brown and Muslim and LGBTQ plus dissent the most. Expanding policing just deepens the systematic injustice that caused all of this in the first place. When people are scared, they cling to authoritarian structures. We've seen this since Trump came into office, with progressives and liberals lionizing institutions like the CIA and FBI that exist primarily to uphold U.S. imperialism and oppression. It's a path that leads to disaster. We need profound, transformative, structural change. We need to dismantle the economic and political systems that have brought us to this point and create new ones that protect people's basic human rights and take care of people's basic needs. We need to abolish failed institutions. I know it's kind of cheesy to quote him, but Albert Einstein famously said, "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." We cannot heal the wounds ripped open today on January 6th by doubling down on the racist and authoritarian policies that got us here. But that won't stop politicians from both parties from attempting to exploit this crisis to push an authoritarian agenda. They'll demand the repeal of Section 230, even though that will actually make it harder to address hate online. They demand more funding for the FBI and cops. This is a crisis, but it's a crisis that demands a true reckoning. It's a crisis that demands we reject the fundamentally flawed ideologies and institutions that have caused so much suffering since this country was built on stolen land. It's a crisis that demands hope and action. Yes, Trump's a fascist, but when are we going to talk about how Democrats enabled this fascist throughout his entire presidency by approving all of his military budgets, which contained billions in funding for the Space Force, funding for Trump's wall, funding for ICE detention centers, and an extension of the Patriot Act. Democrats quietly enable fascism, and when the fascism becomes impossible for the public to ignore, they attempt to act like they oppose it, but in reality, they're complicit.